Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of BacklogBusters, where I'm busting out my gaming backlog one video at a time and letting you know if after all these years these games are worth playing today. In this episode, we're causing a resonance cascade and kicking off a series of games that may never get an ending. Why out of all the games in my backlog did I go back and decide to play Half-Life 1? Well, there seemed like no better way to break in Valve's Steam Deck than to play through their first game, but the problem is I've tried to play through Half-Life 1 several times and always gotten distracted with some newer game that came out. Luckily, there also happened to be a shiny new remake of Half-Life 1 titled Black Mesa that came out in 2020, so with the remake loaded on my Steam Deck, I decided this was the time for me to actually finish Half-Life 1. I kind of started in the Half-Life universe with Half-Life 2 in 2006. It was the game that I set up an account on Steam to play. It blew me away at the time, especially compared to console games I was playing in 2006 with its story, world, and physics. I later played through the 2 episodes that followed the main story and then played the VR prequel to Half-Life 2 titled Half-Life Alyx when it released in 2020. So I definitely enjoyed the series, but was missing the first game and had always wondered how its story fit into the series as a whole. But before we go into that, what is the Half-Life series and why is Half-Life so important to gaming? Half-Life was the first game developed and released by Valve. It was published by Sierra Studios on November 19th, 1998, and Valve having a publisher at all is strange to imagine now that they run the biggest storefront in all of PC gaming with Steam and have published all their own games since the storefront launched in 2003. But going back to 1998, Half-Life garnered rave reviews and still sits at a 96 on Metacritic with a big ol' must-play tag on it, along with almost every game in the series. With quotes from reviewers at the time, like GamePro saying, "A masterpiece of epic proportions, the Saving Private Ryan of first-person shooters." IGN called it a tour de force in game design, the definitive single-player game in a first-person shooter. And GameStop saying that it was the closest thing to a revolutionary step the genre has ever taken. Through a series of subtle and artistic design decisions, Half-Life creates a reality that is self-contained, believable, and thoroughly engaging. And all this was only 2 years after Quake, which was a defining game in the full 3D FPS genre, and only 1 year after GoldenEye 007 released on the N64 and popularized multiplayer FPSs on console. Half-Life was critically and commercially successful when it released, and was later followed by 2004's Half-Life 2, which pushed the envelope even further, garnering another round of great reception, critically and commercially. Half-Life 2 ran off Valve's new engine called the Source Engine, which allowed for advanced physics that defined most of Half-Life 2's puzzles.
Of course, your question touches on one of the basic biological impulses. All its associated hopes and fears for the future of the species. I also detect some unspoken questions.
And alongside Half-Life 2's release, Half-Life 1 received an upgraded port to the Source Engine called Half-Life Source, which brought with it enhanced effects, physics simulation, and more. That port is the one that I've started several times, but never seen all the way through. The Half-Life series later expanded with 2 episodes, which released in 2006 and 2007. They continued the story after Half-Life 2's ending. And a planned 3rd episode that was meant to pick up after the huge cliffhanger ending in Half-Life Episode 2 was only just canceled in 2020. The cancellation was then immediately followed by the announcement of a new Half-Life game, a VR game set between Half-Life 1 and 2 called Half-Life Alyx. But again, I struggled to go back to Half-Life 1 after playing everything from the 2 episodes, and the VR title. Luckily, a mod team started developing a remake of Half-Life in 2005, and after 15 years of development, Crowbar Collective, the developer, with Valve's blessing, released a full commercial remake of Half-Life 1 titled Black Mesa, and this came out in 2020. Now, I'm not sure if others feel differently, but I love a good remake. Making a game more approachable, smoothing off rough edges, updating a game to run or look better on current hardware, as well as a lot of the time releasing it for purchase if it's been out of print or delisted. Now, Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 1 Source are still out there, and they're not lost to time, but with Valve's blessing and 15 years of hard work by passionate fans, I'm considering this remake as checking Half-Life 1 off my backlog. And after a lot of setup and history, let's start talking about this game by jumping right into the things I like the most. First off, the intro. The intro is an incredible introduction to the world and story while not making you feel bored. Apparently with Half-Life, Valve strived to make sure that there were no cutscenes where you would lose control of your character completely. That carries through to the remake, with you able to move, look, and interact uninterrupted through the game. You're never just sitting back, setting your controller down, and watching a big exposition dump play out while you wait to take back control. You play as Gordon Freeman, a theoretical physicist running late for work, going through a normal day at the office until something goes horribly wrong. If you played later games like Half-Life 2 or Bioshock, this game's opening, I feel like, set the precedence for those to follow in, and it's just as effective. Past the intro, Black Mesa still continues to excel at telling the story in that distinctly Valve way that I remember from Half-Life 2, where yes, characters do sometimes talk directly at you, but mostly you get the story and feel for the world through background actors, the decoration of rooms, messages, and blood. And a lot of this is in Half-Life 1 original, but the Black Mesa remake borrows the lessons learned from Valve's later games to enhance it and make it just even more effective. This first game also introduces the by far most well-known and feared enemy in the series, the head crab. By the way, these are very spider-like, so if you want to skip to the next time code and get past any footage of them crawling around and not in their zombie variant, that should be down below. These head crabs may look like a rotisserie chicken with 4 gross legs, but they are more akin to the face hugger from the Alien series. They leap out at their prey, enveloping their head and turning them into lumbering zombies. Because of Gordon's hazard suit he wears, you don't take a ton of damage from them, and they have a predictable arc once you learn it. But I won't lie and say that they didn't cause constant jump scares, or that hearing them as I entered a room didn't cause intense dread. Okay, that should be the last footage that I show of them crawling around. The next enemy you face is this lumbering zombie, which comes from a head crab successfully attaching to a host. They're slow, creepy, and have an incredible strength and can gang up on you. Also, there's sometimes a chance that taking them down detaches the head crab, which then comes for you. Awful, awful. The next enemy of note is the barnacle. These creepy ceiling mouths, they dangle their tongue down and will reel you into their jaws if you accidentally brush too close. It's a stressful moment as you're pulled upwards into their mouths and struggle to take them out before you're eaten. On the bright side, they make for wonderful physics fun, as you can stick a barrel in their tongue to safely walk underneath as they reel it in, or even stick a grenade on them to take out a whole ceiling full in one blast. There are other enemies which aren't nearly as memorable, but these 3 I feel like are the most defining of the series, with subsequent games all continuing to make great use of these horrible creatures in both puzzles and combat. One of the defining features of Half-Life 2, and the rest of the series for me, was the reactive world filled with physics objects, and Black Mesa is no different. Throwing a flare on an enemy who then touches an explosive barrel to set up a chain reaction, watching a head crab leap towards you only to be grabbed by a barnacle, or throwing an object to stagger an enemy, stacking boxes to platform up higher, even barnacles that pull you up so high that even if you do escape, you might die from the fall. Even in Half-Life 1, these interactions exist and make for such an interesting and fun play space, while also giving the environments more life. This also allows for unique puzzles, like using buoyant barrels to raise a bridge. This game actually has quite a lot of puzzles, physics or otherwise, that make the world feel more real and less like a hallway filled with monsters that just run at you. As for the setting, you start in the labs, then after things go wrong, you work to make it to the surface to try and call for help, only to fight more on the surface before heading to space to finish the fight on Xen. Being able to travel to all these different areas, in addition to the way these areas vary up the physics sandbox and combat sandbox, prevents things from getting too stale. This remake makes Half-Life 1 so much more playable today, for me at least. Not that Half-Life 1 is bad by any means, but bringing in some of the design language from Half-Life 2, cleaning up the game and smoothing things out makes it so much easier for me to get into. Even small things like having more than 2 scientist models in the game. With the Half-Life series being so influential, I'm so glad a remake like this actually exists for those who might struggle to go back to the original version like me. But the Black Mesa team went above and beyond by fleshing out the back part of the game. Later in the story, you travel to Xen, where all these creatures are from. And from all the reviews and accounts I've read of Half-Life 1, Xen was the most unfinished, tacked on, and frustrating feeling part of the original game. This remake expands and improves and makes Xen feel on par with the rest of the game in storytelling, fun, and graphical fidelity. And it's one of those reasons I've decided to go and play this remake in the first place, rather than the original source port, because I'd heard the end was kind of disappointing or at least uneven compared to the rest of the game, and Black Mesa corrects all of this and makes it great to play through the start of the game that is mostly Half-Life 1 to the end, where they are making changes and trying to go with what they envision as Valve's original design. But now that I've heaped a lot of praise onto this game, let's talk about some things I disliked about my time with Black Mesa. Once things start going badly for the scientists in Black Mesa, which is pretty early on, you've got no way to defend yourself, eventually finding a security guard who helps take out some of the monsters that found their way into the facility. Later, finding a crowbar, which is kind of the calling card of the series, which gives you limited combat abilities and requires you to get way too close for comfort with pretty much everything. Gordon will slowly build out his arsenal, gaining a pistol, a shotgun, and so on. But for probably the first half of the game, ammo is scarce, and you really have to consider if an approaching enemy is worth wasting a more powerful ammo type on just to take them out quicker, or worth risking your health to get up close and personal with your crowbar. I felt like it really made encounters intense, and a science facility not having plentiful ammo supplies everywhere makes sense to me. But as the game goes on, you start finding a rocket around almost every corner. Sniper ammo, grenades, all manner of weapons and refills, just everywhere. This feels familiar for the time this game was made in. Seeing a container full of rocket ammo usually means there's a big fight coming up. It's not a bad thing, but I did begin to miss the early scrounging for ammo types. Also, the combat strays away from the more intense, smaller battles and scales up to you fighting off whole waves of attackers. I don't consider the combat the strongest point of this game, and seeing more and more large combat encounters, while not bad, just felt a little less exciting each time. Black Mesa feels like an old school PC shooter. Sure, it has partial controller support listed in Steam, and the Steam Deck's customizable controls let you work around games that maybe weren't intended to be played outside of a mouse and keyboard, but there were several times where the amount of enemies, speed of some special enemy types, just felt impossible to hit when playing with the Steam Deck's trackpad, sticks, or motion controls. This isn't a bad thing, again. Some games are just more suited for their original medium, and while I think you can play most of Black Mesa with a controller of some kind, at some point you may need to pull out the old mouse and keyboard for some challenging combat encounters. That may require a more precise aim, and maybe just one that I couldn't perform without the mouse myself. But your mileage may vary depending on what you're familiar with or what you're good at. For this next dislike, I'm not quite sure if this is just me, but the bosses in Black Mesa sometimes confuse me. Sometimes there were puzzle bosses where you can't really defeat them till performing a specific action around the level. Sometimes they were damage sponges, and sometimes they were just unkillable and you had to run from them. Most of the time they deal a ton of damage, and even though the game lets you save anywhere like most PC-only games, they can still be frustrating and it can be hard to determine what to do in some of these encounters. The last dislike I had, which is really small and more of just an odd quirk, this game has some jarring mid-level load. You'll just be walking through a doorway or walk across the center of a room, turn a corner, or even climb too high on a ladder. The game just freezes and hits a loading screen. Then gameplay resumes after a few seconds. As far as I remember, Half-Life 2, the episodes, and even the VR game did this. Again, it's not bad per se, it's just odd, and in a world where developers are masking loading screens all the time in cutscenes as you crawl through vents, pass through narrow passageways, it just feels a little odd in this time to hop back into a classic game like this and run into invisible walls of loading occasionally. Now, with all that in mind, how do I feel about this game overall? And would I recommend the Half-Life 1 Remake Black Mesa as a game that you should have on your backlog? The game starts great. The way the story is woven into the gameplay, the places you go, things you experience as you try to stop the alien threat as Gordon Freeman was all really enjoyable. This being a remake, it did make me wonder how much of this was in Half-Life 1 originally and how much was tweaked or changed for the remake. And from everything I've looked into, Black Mesa mainly attempts to clean up and expand Half-Life 1. The later Zen levels see the most amount of changes, but all for the better from what I've seen. This game does the dual duty of making me really appreciate Half-Life 1, the original, the innovations and strides it made in games of the time and in the first-person shooter genre. It also makes me astounded at the care and love put into this remake. I'm so happy to see this re-release after all these years be as good as it is, and honestly, I'm also glad it's a commercial game so the people who worked on it can make money off of it and go on to make something else. I'm really interested to see where Crowbar Collective actually goes from here and what they put out next. I'm also glad to finally fill in the blanks in my Half-Life series knowledge, and thankful this remake lets me experience a game I've wanted to check out since I played Half-Life 2. So yes, go back and play Black Mesa, and then play Half-Life 2, the episodes, and the VR game, as it was always an incredible series and now has a remake that is as easy to jump into as the later games. If this has convinced you to check out Half-Life 1 or the Black Mesa remake, Thankfully, it's extremely easy to do. Half-Life 1 that was based off the Quake engine is on Steam. Half-Life 1's source port that Valve released around Half-Life 2's launch is also available on Steam. And the remake, Black Mesa, that we've been talking about today is also available on Steam. It's so nice when one of these videos ends with an older game being easy to access, and it's a shame it isn't more common. But that's it for this episode of BacklogBusters. Have you played Half-Life 1 or the Black Mesa remake? What did you think? Is it a must-play game in your opinion? Does it deserve to be on others' backlogs? I'd love to talk about this game and the series as a whole in the comments below. Also, let me know if you have suggestions for what game you think I should clear off my backlog next. I've gotten a few suggestions in the comments. I really appreciate those, and they are on my list. Hopefully I will get to those soon. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe. And if you want to get alerted whenever I get done editing my next video, don't forget to hit the bell icon. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and see you in the next video.